What is fantasy? Today we'll explore the question because I was recently thinking about it because I joined a couple of Discords, one of them being Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews on YouTube. He's a booktuber. Also, I'm on Mike's Book Review channel. And, when you join a Discord, it has like an introduction thing, and you kind of like answer questions like what's your favorite book. Sometimes you'll give like your history or like what are you reading and stuff. And I was thinking about like before 2 years ago, let's say, I had no idea that all these books existed, pretty much. Pretty much everything you see on my shelf I've just gotten in the last couple of years, except for like some Jim Butchers and the Harry Potters there, and I've got up there some Game of Thrones. I thought, in my silly head, because I wasn't keeping track, I wasn't like keeping up with the news, the book news and stuff. It wasn't in a booktube, but I didn't know it existed. I had a Goodreads account, but I didn't really keep track of anything on it, really. I didn't really use it until like a couple years ago. I thought all the fantasy novels were just the Forgotten Realms, like the Drizzt Do'Urden books, the Ravenloft books, the Dragonlance books, which I read when I was in high school. And then I've heard of like other people writing books like Mercedes Lackey and what's the other woman? I always forget her name. Anne McCaffrey. And then I've heard of Terry Brooks' sort of Shannara series. Of course, I've heard of Lord of the Rings. I knew Game of Thrones existed. I'd watched the TV show first, and then I got into the books about a little over 2 years ago, and that's probably what got me back into fantasy. And I think somebody had recommended Ted Williams to me before. I didn't really know anything about him. And who's the other one? Not Terry Brooks. I can't remember, but there's another guy. I kind of thought that was all there was in fantasy. I didn't know there was like all these people writing different kinds of fantasy. I didn't know there's different genres of fantasy. Yeah, so I had been reading Stephen King. I read the Dark Tower. A lot of people consider that fantasy. I would not really. No, there's no dragons. There's no wizards. There's kind of a wizard, but not really. There's a Dark Tower. See that? And like castle-y kind of fantasy stuff. But Stephen King's kind of like in his own category. He just writes weird stuff that nobody else comes up with. And let's see. I got into Orson Scott Card, and it got me into sci-fi. I was reading the sci-fi, and I'd read Harry Potter. I watched the TV show Game of Thrones, got into Game of Thrones, and I'd read a lot of the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. I read all those, pretty much, that were out at the time. I guess I could have thought of those as it's about a wizard, so I didn't really think of it being fantasy because it's in Chicago, and it's like paranormal and modern day. But I guess that counts, and I got into like Larry Correia, and I was reading all of his Monster Hunter books, and I had like a few authors like that. I think I'd read Rachel Kane's Weather Warden series, which is kind of like paranormal fantasy, I guess, modern fantasy, urban fantasy, young adult, I guess you would call it, actually, because you read Ink and Bone and all those books. But what else was I reading? I was reading a lot of stuff. I was reading only like 10 or 12 books a year, too. I thought that was a lot. I get on a booktube and I start seeing people reading like over 100 books a year. Like, what? That's like 2 a week. How do you do that? So then I started learning how to do that. How about reading faster? I don't really read any faster, though. I just had to really focus on it. I wasn't focusing on it. I was just reading whenever I got a spare chance. So, anyway, now that I'm into all these other, like, Abercrombie, John Gwynne, all the ones everybody reads, Scott Lynch, all those kind of guys. Now I understand what it's about. I got super into BookTube. Not really a TikToker, but I've kind of heard of Book Talk. Hadn't really looked into it that much. It's mostly a bunch of girls with the books turned backwards so you can't see what they are until you watch the video. It kind of tricks you. Anyway, I thought we would go into a browser today and look at the types of fantasy because I don't know what these mean. I know what urban fantasy is. But let's find out. We'll do it live. Let's start with just standard fantasy. Here we go. Fantasy is a genre of speculative fiction involving magical elements, typically set in a fictional universe and sometimes inspired by mythology and folklore. Okay, so that's pretty general. This is saying science fiction is a branch of fantasy, and a lot of times you'll see sci-fi and fantasy together. Genre speculative fiction, which typically deals with imaginative and futuristic concepts such as advanced science and technology, space exploration, time travel, parallel universes, and extraterrestrial life. Okay. So I was watching one of Murphy's videos, and she was saying Anatomy... What's that book about? Anatomy of Dragons or something like that? She was saying it was sci-fi? I don't know what it's about something like finding a husband or something. But, you know, if it's got dragons, I would imagine it's probably fantasy. But, I don't know. Urban fantasy, I know. Let's look at this one next. Subgenre of fantasy, replacing supernatural elements in an approximation of a contemporary urban setting. Combination provides the writer with chaotic, is that like Don Quixote-esque plot drivers, unusual character traits, and a platform for classical fantasy tropes without demanding creation of an entirely imagined world. Okay, yeah. So you're just adding, like The Magicians by Lev Grossman would be urban fantasy. Because it's about wizards and Harry Potter. But Harry Potter is mid-grade for kids. I didn't even really consider that fantasy when I read it. I just thought it was about wizards. And like, I knew everybody was into it. So, contemporary fantasy, also known as modern fantasy, is a subgenre of fantasy set in the present day, or more accurately, the time period of the maker. Oh, so if somebody's writing about in the 1800s, writing about dragons, then that's contemporary fantasy because they don't know about the 1900s technology. But you don't really see anything like that. Like, what's the oldest fantasy writer? Like, I don't even know who's like super old. Maybe some like real old Tad Williams or... Oh, Lord of the Rings. That's like, what, 40s, 50s maybe? When did that come out? Let's see what high fantasy is. I think this is also called epic fantasy. Yeah. It's a subgenre defined by the epic nature of its setting or by the epic stature of its characters, themes, or plot. What do you mean by epic, though? High fantasy is set in an alternative fictional world rather than the real or primal world. I think we have to go to Wikipedia and see some examples. Well, at World's End, Lord of the Rings, high fantasy. High fantasy often serves as a broad term to include a number of different flavors, including heroic fantasy, epic fantasy, mythic fantasy, dark fantasy, and wuxia. So, like, I guess Sword of Kagan and Cradle? That's progression fantasy. That's not even one of the things. Maybe Target Orange Tree. I don't know if it's wuxia or not. Jade Legacy, Jade City. That's all like mafia. That's not really wuxia. Maybe like the James Island. No, Poppy War. Would that be wuxia? But like high fantasy. What are some good examples of that? Game of Thrones? No, I would consider that more grimdark. Let me see what grimdark is.
Hello.
Hi.
Are we ready?
Let's get started.
Hello? Oh, there's a video over here. This is a masterclass article. Stop! I'm making a video. Let's see. High fantasy. Set in a magical environment, has its own rules and physical laws. This subgenre's plots and themes have a grand scale and typically center on a single well-developed hero or band of heroes, such as Frodo Baggins in Lord of the Rings. Low fantasy, set in the real world. Low fantasy includes unexpected magical elements that shock characters, like the plastic figurines come to life, and the ending in the cupboard. That's low fantasy? Set in the real world? Is that not modern fantasy or urban fantasy? Magical realism. While similar to low fantasy, magical realism characters accept fantastical elements like levitation and telekinesis as a normal part of the otherwise realistic world. 100 Years of Solitude, 1967. This is kind of making me think The Magicians. Sword and Sorcery. Subset of high fantasy. Focuses on sword-wielding heroes such as Conan the Barbarian, as well as magic or witchcraft. The one I'm reading now, The Magician by Raymond Feist, I think that would fit here. It kind of reminds me of the Gummy Bears. Like you have a king, prince and princesses, you know, you got knights, you got wizards, goblins, trolls, dragons, fire drakes, that kind of a thing. But then, that's what high epic fantasy is, though, also. So I'm not sure. Dark fantasy, combining elements of fantasy and horror, its aim is to unnerve and frighten readers like the gargantuan otherworldly monsters and HP. So, like Frankenstein? Or, what's that one book? It's like a fantasy horror. I can't remember what it's called. It's got a picture of a knight on the front. Fables and fairy tales. Let's see. Personified animals. Oh, okay, so it's like crazy, cartoonish fantasy. Fairy tales are typically set in distant magical worlds, so with the beginning like once upon a time, land far, far away. Trolls, dragons, witches, and other supernatural. See, that's what I thought the Raymond Feist book was. I thought it was one of these. Or these. So, then you got superhero fiction, which is like, you know, Brandon Sanderson has some. A bunch of other ones I've read. I can't remember what they are offhand. So these all sound like kind of the same. It seems like it would be hard. Like low fantasy seems like the weirdest to distinguish. What does this one say? Or intrusion fantasy is a subgenre where magical events intrude on an otherwise normal. Okay. So, like the movie, the He-Man movie, where you got a normal world and the He-Man characters come in from another realm or something. Is that like low fantasy? Or the Magicians? Or... Man, this is not helping me understand. I feel like I'm just getting more lost. Magical realism paints a realistic view of the world while also adding magical elements, often blurring the lines. Okay. So maybe Kingkiller Chronicles, because it was kind of really realistic magic based on sympathy and alchemy, which is a real thing, that kind of history. And then you also got historical fantasy category that incorporates fantastic elements into a more realistic narrative. There's like an alternate fantasy or alternate history. Would that be considered historical fantasy? Or like King Arthur. King Arthur is like historical fantasy because King Arthur didn't really exist. Or Robin Hood, I think is what they're saying. Yeah, Arthurian, Celtic, or Dark Ages could just easily be placed in historical fantasy. Or the Saxon Tales, although I think that's based on real Vikings. Bernard Cornwell. Let's see what it says about Grimdark. Tone, style, or setting that is particularly dystopian, amoral, and violent. This term is inspired by the tagline of the tabletop strategy game Warhammer 40k. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Huh. See, everybody says Joe Abercrombie's grimdark, but it's not really. The setting is pretty moral. It's just the characters were kind of immoral or amoral. I don't know. Paranormal Romance, of course, is just like teeny bopper vampires and werewolf fucking, and then you got fables, supernatural fiction. Genre of speculative fiction that exploits or is centered on supernatural themes, often contradicting naturalist assumptions of the real world. What would that be? What would be an example of supernatural fiction? A supernatural theme? I don't know. I'm thinking like witches or something, or like if there was a world just goblins were real or something. I don't even know what you're talking about. Let me see. Let's look at this one real quick. Give me some examples. Oh, look at all these words over here. Diesel punk. Okay. Solar punk, splatterpunk, steampunk, shinmo. King Arthur gave this reader a sense of presence of holy things. Wuthering Heights. And the natural surroundings of it all takes place in the eerie mood it evokes. This is one of the first interests of supernatural horrors being evoked in literature. Turn of the Screw. Huh. Supernatural fiction. I didn't know Wuthering Heights had any supernatural stuff in it. And then here they say H.P. Lovecraft, but that was in the other one. So what the hell? What's dark fantasy? Not grimdark, just dark. Just slightly dark. Anime and manga. Berserk? Attack on Titan. Ah, yeah, that's pretty dystopian. I can see that. Pan's Labyrinth? Alice in Wonderland is dark fantasy? Yeah, I guess you could say that. Or Pan's Labyrinth has been described as a spin on Alice in Wonderland. Legend? That's one where the guy finds a unicorn. Yeah. Why is that dark fantasy? That's more like a sword and sorcery or something, I would think. Occult detective. Ooh, so that's like Jim Butcher, I guess. But he's urban fantasy. It's just about an occult detective. I think a lot of these genres, they're like a Venn diagram, and they have a lot of like crossing over. Charles DeLint, he writes about fairies and stuff, right? Comic fantasy, that's just like anime and stuff. Adventure fiction. Okay, that's like Indiana Jones, maybe? Yeah. I think we was a science fantasy hybrid between sci-fi and fantasy, I guess. That's what we were talking about before. I'm still confused about low fantasy versus like just fantasy or contemporary fantasy. I guess contemporary could be high or low depending on what. Like if you wrote in the Dark Ages, then it's contemporary, but it's also high fantasy because you live in a time where there's castles and dragons and shit. Well, it's not dragons, horses, knights, people who claim to be wizards but aren't really wizards. Alright, this wasn't as interesting as I thought it was going to be. It's kind of silly, but it killed 17 minutes.